Canada expels 6 Indian diplomats after the RCMP said it found evidence of serious criminal activity. These developments come after a high-level meeting between Canadian and Indian officials in Singapore over the weekend. David Morrison, the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Nathalie Drouin, the National Security Advisor, traveled to Singapore to meet with Ajit Doval, India's National Security Advisor. They were joined by a senior official from the RCMP who walked them through the evidence the National Police Force had collected. That included intercepted Indian communications and other information that the RCMP has found since the murder of Hardeep Singh Nijjar. Canada believes Indian diplomats were collecting evidence on Sikh activists and sending those details back to the government. And those activists were later threatened or attacked, or in the case of Nijjar, murdered. A Canadian official says Doval did admit that Indian diplomats collected information, but denied it led to violence and denied any role in violent acts in Canada. India also refused to waive diplomatic immunity and allow police to interview the diplomats. So just before 9 a.m. today, Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly delivered the order expelling India's High Commissioner and 5 other diplomats from the country. India responded by expelling 6 Canadian diplomats, including Acting High Commissioner Stuart Wheeler.
The Government of Canada has done what India has long been asking for. Canada has provided credible, irrefutable evidence of ties between agents of the Government of India and a murder of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil. Now it is time for India to live up to what it said it would do and look into those allegations. It is in the interest of both our countries and the peoples of our countries to get to the bottom of this. Canada stands ready to cooperate with India.
Dominic LeBlanc is the Minister of Public Safety, and he joins me in the studio now. Minister, thanks for coming in on a pretty extraordinary day. I want to start with the RCMP statement because they sort of gave us the scope and breadth of what we're dealing with here, where they called this an extraordinary situation, compelling them to go public, because we don't see news conferences like this very often. But they felt the need to do it due to the significant threat to public safety in our country. How would you describe this threat to public safety in our country right now?
I think you're right, David, to say that it was an extraordinary step. The RCMP kept me informed at a high level of some of this investigative work, but they concluded in their own judgment that it was important to disrupt and dismantle what was increasingly a violent, organized criminal effort, including the participation of 6 individuals who work for the Indian government, diplomats who are in Canada. It is unusual, as you say, that the RCMP stand up and talk about evidence they've collected over many, many months in a number of different investigations, I would assume. Normally, we learn about these things when criminal charges are laid and a suspect is arrested and then there's a court process. But they thought that it was important to disrupt and dismantle this increasingly aggressive and concerning criminal activity in many parts of the country. It wasn't just 1 or 2 cities. I heard about it from mayors in different communities in Western Canada and Ontario, heard increasingly about it in Quebec. So the RCMP thought this was an important step to disrupt and dismantle this activity. The Minister of Foreign Affairs expelled these 6 diplomats. But David, they're also continuing actively a number of criminal investigations with police partners in almost a dozen Canadian cities looking into specific criminal activities. My hope is that those investigations lead also to criminal charges and ultimately convictions.
A dozen Canadian cities. There are a lot of numbers flying around today, and I appreciate there is a lack of specificity required to protect the integrity of the investigations. But when Commissioner Drouin and his deputy are talking about 8 people have been arrested for murder, 22 have been arrested for extortion, and you say a dozen Canadian cities. Are these all activities and incidents that tie directly back to the Government of India and the diplomats they had in Canada?
Yeah, so I'm not involved in the intricacies of ongoing active police operations. The RCMP shared with me a list of municipal police forces that they have partnered with as part of these different investigations, and I was surprised the extent to which so many Canadian communities were working with the RCMP in these investigations. So I think that Commissioner shared what information he can share. I have a lot of faith in the work that Commissioner Duhem does, the Deputy Commissioner Mark Flynn, who, as you noted, was with other officials in Singapore. These are very experienced, very senior police officers who have taken a lot of time with the help of dozens and dozens of colleagues in the RCMP and, as I said, partners in other police forces and federal intelligence agencies. So I've had a privileged chance to see this remarkable work being done. And I think Canadians, and particularly Sikh Canadians, who understandably and have been sharing with us and publicly their concerns for the safety of their community, they need to know the RCMP are very, very engaged with other police partners, and they should have a lot of confidence that they'll continue to do the work necessary to bring before justice people perpetrating these crimes.
You say disrupt and dismantle. We've seen these arrests, but the big event today was the expulsion of the 6 Indian diplomats, including the High Commissioner to Canada. Is that dismantling a criminal organization, in your view, kicking out 6 Indian government officials?
Well, again, I don't want to speak for the commissioner. His news conference, he shared the details that he and the prosecutors and lawyers that would advise him in terms of what's appropriate to share publicly. He shared what he was able to share. But if 6 Indian diplomats were expelled as a result of the RCMP evidence collected in this investigation, I think that speaks for itself. But it isn't the end of the story, David. This is what, in the RCMP's independent judgment, was an important step to disrupt and dismantle, to make it harder for this criminal organization to continue to perpetrate these increasingly violent acts. But they'll continue to do the normal police work that they do with partners across the country and bring before the criminal justice system those that decide to perpetrate criminal acts in Canada. And I spoke today, for example, with the U.S. Attorney General, Merrick Garland, the Homeland Security Secretary in the United States, Alejandro Mayorkas, precisely to share with them the information that the RCMP were bringing out publicly today, but to urge them to continue to work with us and to share information the FBI might have, other American intelligence agencies. There has been a very, very extensive collaboration to date. They said that to me. They have thanked us in some cases for information that we've shared with them. But it's very important, I think, particularly Five Eyes countries, the UK, the US, for example, right, that this work be seamless. So I'm very encouraged that that'll be the case.
I was struck by the language you're using in this interview, but in particular the language the Prime Minister used earlier. When we talk about stories like this, in my job, we have to use alleged, claim, allegations. There's none of that coming from the Government of Canada. You're absolutely convinced, it sounds to me, from what the Prime Minister was saying, that the Indian government is clearly involved with this. Otherwise, you're not kicking out these 6 diplomats.
Well, I was convinced by the evidence that the RCMP collected as part of an ongoing and extensive criminal investigation over many months. The RCMP commissioner is Canada's most senior police officer. He leads an organization of 20,000 plus police officers and 10,000 civilians. He's not going to stand at a news conference on Thanksgiving Monday at 11:30 and talk publicly about evidence if he's not absolutely convinced that this evidence is reliable and credible. And when the government is given that evidence, the Foreign Affairs Minister took, I think, the only decision that she could, and she expelled these diplomats.
The other thing that Commissioner Duhem says today, and this is from the written statement, that they have found links tying agents of the government of India to homicides, plural. There's an S there. We know of Hardeep Singh Nijjar. I know you were asked for a specific number, and I appreciate you can't do that, but that's not a typo, right? We're talking about more than one killing?
Again, I don't type out the RCMP statements myself.
But you would know, would you not, if it's more than one, based on us getting to this point?
I know what I read in the statement, and as I said, I know that these statements are vetted in great detail, precisely not to prejudice ongoing criminal investigations. The last thing that they would want to do is say something publicly that later becomes an excuse for a defense attorney or for a judge to decide that for whatever reason the trial is going to be stayed, the charges will be stayed, the trial will be aborted. So all of this stuff was very much in the hands of the RCMP. And as I say, I have faith that they used the best language they could, and their statement speaks for itself.
It is quite an alarming thing for Canadians to hear. I think you would agree, right? That homicides, violent acts, plural, extortions. We have seen all kinds of stories in local news about what's happening in South Asian communities, Edmonton, you know, all around Toronto, the lower mainland of British Columbia. Narendra Modi nominally leads a democracy and is invited to groups like the G7 to meet with the Western countries on how to deal with the problems of the day. But then we look at something like this. I mean, is India an ally as long as Narendra Modi and his government are in charge and operations like this are happening overseas?
That's a good question that the Indian government and Prime Minister Modi could answer.
How do you view them, though?
Well, I view it as extremely unfortunate that at multiple entreaties they have refused to participate with Canadian law enforcement and diplomatic officials in an investigation where senior RCMP officers and people as senior as the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, David Morrison, or Nathalie Drouin, the National Security Intelligence Advisor, are sharing with their counterparts details of evidence collected by Canada's National Police Force, that the Indian government would refuse to acknowledge the concern that in a rule of law country like Canada that values its territorial integrity, the sovereignty of Canada. We respect the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of India. We wish they would do the same. And in circumstances where they couldn't, it's too bad that they won't participate with Canadian law enforcement officials in stopping this increasingly violent criminal, organized criminal network, and ensure that all of the investigative weight is brought to bear to hold those before the justice system that have perpetrated these acts.
Can you help us understand what it was about this point in the investigation and in the examination of these issues that led the RCMP to go to the Indian government and confront them with the information and seek the ability to interview the diplomats? Is it because of the public safety concerns? Is that what drove the timing here, or were they at a point in their investigation that they need the cooperation of India to move to the next step? Because I know this is something Commissioner Doem said on the show in May around the Niger investigation, that they weren't getting the help they needed. So has it just gotten to that point, or was it driven by public safety as far as you know?
Yeah, and again, I want to be careful not to speak for the RCMP, because these are independent operational decisions that they appropriately make on their own. But I took the Deputy Commissioner, Mark Flynn, and the Commissioner's words very seriously when they said they had a growing concern around public safety, and they thought that the moment had arrived to take this extraordinary step to disrupt, dismantle this criminal enterprise. That was their decision. I have a lot of faith that they made that judgment at the right moment for the right reasons. But I also have a lot of faith that their ongoing criminal work with other partner police agencies hopefully will bring other people before the courts facing criminal charges, because that ultimately is the price that people who perpetrate criminal acts in Canada should face. They should be before a competent criminal court to face those charges.
So just as a final point, I mean, if public safety is driving this, do you think these actions today lower the risk of public safety? Because there's going to be a lot of people out there who go to Gurdwaras in particular who are going to be very, I mean, they've been alarmed by this for a long time, but maybe especially alarmed that this could escalate. So do you think this has diffused that threat level to some degree? Do you need to take steps in conjunction with partners at provincial and municipal levels to ensure, I don't know, a greater level of protection for these communities?
So we're always concerned about that, David. We talk to members of the Sikh community. I do all the time. I spoke to colleagues in our caucus representing Sikh communities earlier today. So this is a constant concern for us. I'm traveling to Yellowknife on Wednesday morning to meet all of the provincial and territorial justice and public safety ministers with my colleague Arif Virani. I'm going to be talking to our public safety provincial and territorial counterparts about this. In the RCMP's judgment, they thought that this would disrupt and help dismantle this criminal enterprise. But I continue to worry and continue to work to ensure that those in communities that are threatened, it's not only the Sikh community, but in this case, they're predominantly targeted. We have programs that help them with security infrastructure investments at their places of worship, their community centers. They can hire private security guards, and the government helps them pay at particular events where they have a concern. So we've been doing that work for a number of months with all kinds of communities, including the Sikh community. But the RCMP will be very, very vigilant over the next hours and days. And they have, as I said, an enormous partnership that is very, very strong with local police of jurisdiction in many of these cities. The mayor of Edmonton talks to me about the work that the Edmonton Police Service does. So that's just one example amongst many. In Peel region, there's a deep, deep connection also, the Ontario Provincial Police. So I'm very confident that that work's done, David, but you're right to highlight the concern that many people in those communities feel, but they should know that the Government of Canada and the RCMP in particular are very much at work.
Minister of Public Safety Dominic LeBlanc, appreciate your time on a busy day.
Thank you, David. Have a great day.